Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 864 for March 28th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
We got a lot of pushback from consumers for not doing the show in November, which we felt was absolutely the wrong time, and it turned out we shut the show down, and a couple weeks later we had all that fall, the late fall outbreak and so forth. So the timing was responsible on our part to hold off on the show.
Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic a year ago, in-person whiskey events have been few and far between. That is about to change. While large indoor public events are still banned in many countries and most U.S. states, the coming weeks have events in Florida, Nevada, and Texas. Promoter Dave Sweet has been running whiskey festivals for nearly 17 years, including one of the rare in-person events during the pandemic last fall in New Jersey. Not only was that Whiskey and Barrel Night event not a super spreader, there were no new cases of COVID-19 exposure connected to the event. Now, Dave Sweet is getting ready for what will arguably be the largest whiskey event of the past 12 months, the Whiskey Obsession Festival, April 8th in Tampa. He'll join us later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the latest event cancellations from Europe, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and
now the title for World's Best Single Malt 2021.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Dewar's, and let's get back to this episode of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. While the U.S. tariff on single malt whiskeys from Scotland and Northern Ireland has been suspended, as the Biden administration tries to work out differences on aircraft subsidies with the UK and the European Union, we are still seeing damage to the Scotch whiskey industry. The latest export data from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs shows worldwide Scotch whiskey exports in January were down 63% from January of last year. And to be fair, the U.S. tariffs are not the only reason for that decline. Remember, Brexit took full effect on January 1st. Analysts at the Food and Drink Federation found that Scotch exports to Europe declined by 75% from the previous year. The analysis blames part of that decline on 2020 stockpiling to avoid potential post-transition issues. While there are no tariffs on Scotch whiskey exports to Europe post-Brexit, there are border delays and extensive paperwork that have made it harder to send shipments from the UK to Europe. Of course, there is also the economic impact from the COVID-19 pandemic to deal with as well. Back to the tariffs for a minute. New U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai spent her first week on the job in virtual conversations with her colleagues in Europe, the UK, and other key trading partners. While those meetings were closed to press, we did get readouts afterward showing that the talks did include both the aircraft subsidy dispute and the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. Those tariffs led to the European Union and the UK imposing 25% tariffs on imports of American whiskeys back in 2018. Unless there is a resolution by June 1st, those tariffs are scheduled to double to 50%. Turning to Scotland now, Ardbeg has officially opened its new stillhouse on Islay. It's a twin to the distillery's original stillhouse on the inside, right down to the rivets on the stills. That's expected to nearly double Ardbeg's annual production capacity over time. Meanwhile, Beam Suntory has announced an upgraded restoration plan for Glen Garioch Distillery in Old Meldrum, Scotland. The company will invest £6 million at Glen Garioch to revive some historic production processes at the distillery, which dates back to 1797. That includes what may well be the first new floor maltings built at a distillery in Scotland since Kilhoman opened on Islay back in 2005, along with a return to direct-fired heating for the wash still. That's been phased out at most distilleries in favor of steam heat for both efficiency and safety reasons, but the project will use a new state-of-the-art design that maximizes safety while reducing the distillery's carbon footprint by up to 15%. The project will be completed later this year. In other news, Whiskey Magazine handed out its World Whiskies Awards on Thursday in an online ceremony.
And now the title for World's Best Single Malt 2021 goes to the Glen Garioch 10 years old batch 4. Congratulations.
That's World Whiskies Awards Director Anita Usasi of Whiskey Magazine. Other winners included W.L. Weller CYPB as the world's best bourbon, Dewar's Double Double 21 as the world's best blended whiskey, Lot 40 Dark Oak as the world's best rye, and Redbreast 21 as the world's best pot still whiskey. Irish Distillers International Marketing Director Brendan Buckley was the fifth inductee for the 2021 class in Whiskey Magazine's Hall of Fame, while Icons of Whiskey global winners included Brown-Forman as Distiller of the Year, Cascade Hollow's Nicole Austin as Distillery Manager of the Year. Bob Dalgarno of the Glen Turret was named Master Distiller/Blender of the Year, and Scotland's Knockneen Distillery was named the Sustainable Distillery of the Year. We'll have more on that with Knockneen founder Annabelle Thomas on next week's episode. There are links to the complete list of winners for both the World Whiskies Awards and Icons of Whiskey Awards in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And full disclosure, I am proud to have won the Icons Award for Communicator of the Year. Lots of new whiskeys to talk about this week. We'll start with Highland Park, which released its newest edition of Highland Park 50-year-old this week. The whiskeys come from 9 casks originally laid down back in 1968, along with a small amount of the 2018 release of 50-year-old. That one also had some of the original 2010 batch of 50-year-old Highland Park in it. Only 274 bottles of the 2021 release will be available worldwide. The recommended retail price, $30,000 each. There is also a much more affordable single-cask Highland Park for the U.S. market. It's a collaboration with the guys behind the Scotch in the City Instagram account, and is an 11-year-old malt bottled at 65.4% ABV. It'll sell for $155 a bottle and is expected to generate $15,000 in donations for the First Responders Children's Foundation COVID-19 Emergency Response Fund. I've received a sample of this one. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. Jura has released its first rum cask finish single malt. It started out in ex-bourbon barrels and was then finished in Caribbean rum casks. It'll be available initially at Tesco stores in the UK for £45 a bottle, with wider distribution in the works. Irish Distillers has released a new edition in its Method and Madness range of experimental whiskies. This one is a single pot still whiskey from Middleton that was finished in Hungarian mulberry wood casks. It's available now online and at retailers in Ireland and Finland, with a recommended retail price of €95 a bottle. In the U.S., Kentucky's Castle and Key Distillery is coming out with its new Slow Hands Single Barrel Rye. It's the first single barrel release for the distillery and follows up on the debut release of Castle and Key's Restoration Rye last December. Brett Connors of Castle and Key explained the new whiskeys on a Zoom call with whiskey writers.
After we launched Restoration, through that process, we had identified on our sensory and organoleptic team a variety of really exceptional barrels. And then our sensory and blending team worked really, really hard to not have to blend those. You know, often when you're working at smaller volume blends, a single barrel can be really impactful on the final good. But we were able to kind of work around it. So we were able to identify kind of a series of barrels that we thought were quite exceptional, which then allowed us to take the time to launch this brand.
The first 4 single-barrel bottlings will be released each Friday at the distillery for the next few weeks. The first one went on sale this past Friday. There will be more releases in the coming months that will make it to Castle and Key retailers around the U.S. As for when we might see the distillery's first bourbon?
I think that's a great question, Mark. I think with our bourbon, we definitely intend to release single barrels of bourbon at some juncture. Right now, we're still kind of evaluating when we want to release the first kind of inaugural bourbon, knowing that it better be really, really good. You know, with the pedigree of the facility, with the history on site, like that first bourbon just needs to be really exceptional.
I'll have my tasting notes for one of the Slow Hands Ryes in a few minutes, and for all 4 releases soon at WhiskyCast.com. Beam Suntory is kicking off the 2021 releases of Booker's Bourbon with the first batch of the year. Donahue's batch is named for retired Jim Beam sales manager Mike Donahue, who worked alongside Booker No and helped create the Booker's Bourbon brand. It's bottled at 63.65% ABV and carries a recommended retail price of $89.99 a bottle in the U.S. Lost Lantern is out with its second batch of single cask American whiskeys. That batch includes 3 single malts from Whiskey Del Bac in Arizona, a bourbon from Balcones in Texas, and a rye whiskey from the New York Distilling Company. Recommended retail prices range from $70 to $100 each. And finally, we turn to Vermont, where there's a new whistle pig. Sort of. It's actually a collaboration with another Vermont icon, Ben & Jerry's, which used Whistle Pig's Piggyback Rye in its new Whiskey Biz ice cream. You've heard of caramel coloring being added to whiskeys. In this case, Ben & Jerry's flavor guru Eric Fredette told us they added the whiskey to the caramel.
We're all about the quality of our ingredients, and if we can get something down the road, local is always great. This has been really an amazing partnership. We have a vendor that makes our caramel, and we had Piggyback sent to them, and they added that to our caramel, which adds an incredible depth of flavor, plus all those creamy caramel notes. It's pretty amazing. It's good as a swirl in this pint flavor, and it's also good. You could make some at home if you just bought a good jar of caramel and some Piggyback and mixed it yourself.
It's not the first time Ben & Jerry's has done a whiskey-flavored ice cream, of course. You may remember the Urban Bourbon flavor they released several years ago. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. Join us this Friday night for the next Happy Hour live webcast. It's going to be a special one. Longtime Glen Grant distillery manager Dennis Malcolm will be my guest, the night before he celebrates his 60th year in the Scotch whiskey business. We'll get started at 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time, 2100 GMT, on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. We do have some event changes to report. The Whiskey Lounge has postponed its London Whiskey and Spirits Weekender event in mid-May, along with the Bristol Whiskey and Spirits Festival in July. New dates will be announced in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, Cape Byron Distillery in McLeod's Chute, New South Wales, is hosting an in-person and online screening of The Water of Life this Thursday in Australia. Moonshine University in Louisville, Kentucky has Stave and Thief Executive Bourbon Steward classes on April 9th and 12th, and the Texas Whiskey Festival is set for the 16th at Star Hill Ranch near Austin. Remember, all in-person events are subject to change on short notice, depending on local public health restrictions. So, make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. We do update the calendar at WhiskyCast.com throughout the week as we get updates on event changes and details on new events. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online, too. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by the Distiller's Edition collection. COVID-19 still has major parts of the whiskey world in flux. Bars and restaurants are starting to reopen in some areas, while other areas are going back into lockdown or extending current lockdowns to prevent another surge in COVID cases. Some distilleries are starting to reopen their visitors' centers while not allowing tours of production areas to keep their key personnel from potential exposure. And this weekend, I had an email asking for recommendations on what whiskeys to buy at Los Angeles International Airport's duty-free shop, only to get a follow-up email noting that the duty-free shop was closed, along with most of the other stores in the international terminal. Then there's the whiskey festival scene. Virtually every large-scale whiskey event worldwide was either canceled or postponed starting last March, after the scale of the pandemic became clear, with one exception, the Whiskey and Barrel Night event last September in Paramus, New Jersey, just outside of New York. It was held outdoors to comply with New Jersey state requirements, with limited attendance, mandatory masks, and social distancing, and there were no subsequent cases of COVID among the participants. Whiskey and Barrel Night founder Dave Sweet has been organizing whiskey festivals for many years. His group took over the annual Whiskey Obsession Festival after its 2019 event in Sarasota, Florida, and is going ahead with plans to hold the next one April 8th in Tampa. Florida has been a hot spot for both springtime travel and new COVID cases, and we need to make it clear that state officials have taken away the authority of local governments to impose mask mandates or any other restrictions stronger than what the state has in place. When I talked with Dave Sweet this weekend, he made it clear that they believe they can hold a safe event, even though some major whiskey brands are not quite ready to put their people back out in public yet. Whiskey Obsession was delayed twice last year because of COVID. You were able to pull off the Whiskey and Barrel Night event in New Jersey last fall.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that in a minute, but April 8th, you're going to jump back on the boat here, right?
Yeah, the venue, believe it or not, was actually full. And so we had to take April 8th or like next November. So I said, no, let's get this going. We got a lot of pushback from consumers for not doing the show in November, which we felt was absolutely the wrong time. And it turned out we shut the show down in a couple weeks later, we had all that fall, the late fall outbreak and so forth. So the timing was responsible on our part to hold off on the show, even though we took some heat from some very anxious consumers. The industry also appreciated us putting it off and felt it was a responsible thing to do. But what we're seeing is a lot of positive feedback from industry in Florida. And the long and the short of it is the brands that are out on a national basis, so in all your big brands, are holding off on any travel. And even some of the smaller distributors and importers are hedging away from travel just because they don't have all of their staff vaccinated yet. And I think that's the primary concern, is when everyone starts to get vaccinated and then COVID really gets under control, we'll see the Beam Suntories and the Diageos and Pernots and loosen up. Even Winebow, who we're very close with, is on a national travel restriction. So fortunately, Florida's a major market, and there's a lot of Florida reps, and we've gotten fantastic response from them in a lot of very cool brands. Bardstown Bourbon will be there for the first time, and a bunch of others, Chicken Cock, and some major players. So we're looking forward to having the Turlotto gang. But again, it's mostly Florida reps. And then the response from the consumers has been phenomenal. VIP's been sold out for over a month. We're getting great response on the general admission tickets. And I think we're going to be real close to being sold out for both tables, booth space, and attendance. A little bit smaller. I think we're going to max it out at probably 450, 480 for the show, where the venue normally would host upwards of 800 or 900 easily.
What COVID restrictions are you going to put in place at the show? We know that Florida is pretty much, for lack of a better term, unrestricted now, as far as the state's concerned, in terms of mask requirements and things like that. What are you going to require that goes over and above what the state requires? The venue and our office have had long conversations, and I was just down there a week or two ago. A mask will be required to come in. It will be a little bit of individual discretion on at the booth, and obviously when people are sitting down having dinner, because they're sampling. So we're going to be asking people to be considerate and understanding of fellow tasters. Our experience, most of the brands, most of the representatives will be wearing masks, or to some extent. We're also spreading the tables out. So we're going to max out at about 35 exhibitors, where normally this would host one of our normal events at 50 plus exhibitors, 6 foot space in between each table. Again, working that out with the venue. And we've also expanded. There is a large outside courtyard area, which we are incorporating into the venue. And then we will keep all the doors open, a lot of airflow, big garage door size doors, and so forth, to really maximize a lot of elbow room, a lot of extra space, making our VIP area much bigger than usual and spreading it out. And then, of course, controlling the total overall attendance. Who said no, that they weren't ready to even let their Florida reps take part?
Well, nobody has, without putting a particular brand in the spotlight, William Grant is being very conservative. And so they're very hesitant about in-person tastings yet. And we absolutely respect that, and we support them. Michter's being very family-oriented and a very tight company, very close with all of their staff and incredibly personable, has refrained from participating in the Florida show, even though they were scheduled, and they're just rolling over their participation. And a lot of the distributors have been light on staff. So it's hard for the distributors to step in. But we're working through it. So those are a couple of the brands. And again, some of the others, like Winebow, is on a national travel restriction. And so it's hard for them to have anyone staff the show, but we're covering it for them. We have hired an army of bartenders, and will be supervised by myself and the staff on some of the brands that want to be there but don't have staff, but are, willing to make sure the product is there. So we can still reach a happy median between having the product there, having great whiskey for the attendees to taste, and still having everybody work within their comfort level of the current situation.
We talked briefly earlier about your New Jersey show last fall in Paramus. Yes. That was held outdoors, mostly in complete coordination with the state requirements that were in place at that time. As near as I can tell, and I did follow up afterwards or do some checking, and I don't think that resulted in any increased cases or any spread of COVID at your event. What did you learn from that you're able to incorporate here? Because that's been pretty much the only whiskey festival of any size, realistically, in the U.S. in about the last year.
Correct, absolutely. A few things. The attendees are far more interested in quality than quantity. And Mark, you and I go far enough back to where there was a little competition between the two largest shows in the country on how many exhibitors we had and how many different whiskeys we had. And for a few years, it kept climbing. And those were fantastic, wonderful days. And obviously, we all miss that. But the consumers really had a fantastic event because it was smaller, but it was more intimate, and they could really get to know and understand the whiskeys, go back for a second or third tasting without feeling guilty about not tasting something else. So it really was about a quality event, far more than size and quantity. People, for the most part, 99.9%, are respectful and courteous of other people's position on things, and they actually embraced it. So we're going to incorporate that into our future shows, really trying to be sensitive to each individual person's feelings, and that goes in both directions, and trying to work through. And we can do an outside show. People are willing to embrace something different. And that's really what we're trying to incorporate in our show. Obviously growing it, relaunching very big and with some new messaging and some new presentation, and embrace the next generation, so to speak, of events.
This is going to pretty much be the way of life from now on, you think? Smaller, more intimate events with fewer brands and fewer attendees to try to get the comfort level back up?
My feeling is that it's going to grow very fast. And I think we're going to be back to probably 90% of what we think of as normal very quickly. I think we're going to have a transition period. And we're looking forward to being a part of the transition. So Florida will, like I said, probably in the neighborhood of 30 tables, 30 exhibitors, 120, 150 whiskeys, which is the way we used to measure all the shows, and I just referenced a moment ago. New York, we're looking to try to get back to that 45, 50 tables exhibitor space, but more spread out. I think that we're not going to see shows where the booths or the tables are a foot apart like in the old days till later this fall. I think there will be a transition period where people will get more comfortable. People are not going to want to be shoulder to shoulder packed into a show, I think, probably for a while. I look forward to getting back to those days. There is a certain camaraderie and closeness and just a fantastic feeling of being with 500 to 1,000 people, all with the same interests, and being able to talk whiskey sometimes to new people coming in looking for something cool to taste, and that aficionado really looking for that exquisite, interesting whiskey, all in the same room. But yeah, I think it'll be a transition over the next 9 months. I would say by November, December, by the end of our fall season, the end of Whiskey Fest, November, December, we're going to pretty much be back to normal, I would anticipate.
You're doing this in Tampa, and Florida is one of those states, as I've alluded to before, that has been very open in its approach. Most other states, you couldn't do this yet, right?
It would be very hard. It'd be next to impossible. Here in Chicago, we're at a 50% attendance in the bars and restaurants, and I think that it might even open up a little bit more. But a lot of it is just the national brands, and the industry would like it to go slower. And the industry is being very considerate and concerned of their employees, which is really fantastic to see. You know, we've all been there, worked these long hours, these brutal events and brutal hours in the industry, and finish something and get on a plane and go the next. And this has caused everyone to step back and look at quality of work environment, consideration to everybody involved, that maybe was needed a little bit. So that's where I think this is going to lead to. But no, you're right. We could not do this in any other state. Also, the media says one thing about Florida, but when I was down there, every restaurant I went into all had a sign up front that asked that you have a mask on when you walked in and when you went to the restroom. You know, I sat at a bar and had a business meeting for 3 hours and did not have a mask on, but when I went up to use the restroom or went to leave the restaurant, I put a mask on. And it was A, considerate to their request as an independent store owner, and B, to the other people that were there that were still mask conscious or still were getting out but wanted to be cautious.
I know it's only going to be, at least for right now, your show in Tampa, the Nth in Vegas in April, a couple of shows in Texas so far. We are starting to see other shows still in Europe being canceled or rescheduled for later this fall, but it looks like the U.S. and Australia may be among the first to actually return to live whiskey festivals. I know there's one in Sydney, May 14th and 15th, and I think it's a start. But are you surprised that it's taken us essentially a year and taken a year out of this business?
Yes. I understand, and I fully get it. And that's why, when, like you mentioned, Whiskey Obsession had been postponed a couple times because I kept thinking that we were going to get over the hump, and we had a lot of people that were itching to get consumers that were itching to get back, and we really wanted to take care of our consumers. So yes, I'm surprised that it took this long for us to get going on it. No, I'm surprised that the whole situation did, but as things have evolved, I'm not surprised that we're at, right now in hindsight, I understand it, I guess is a better way to say it. A year ago, yes, I would have bet the farm that we would have been open in the fall.
What is your biggest worry going into Whiskey Obsession next week?
To be honest, we're, aside from normal show stresses of running shows after 17 years, I still get that. You're always worried about everything being perfect. We're really excited about it. We've had some requests from some attendees to roll their tickets over if they can't get vaccinated, or just in general rolling tickets over. But it's been about 5% out of 190 VIPs. Literally a dozen, 15 people have asked, if they can get a refund if they can't attend, or to just roll over. So I really don't have any. From when I was down there 2 weeks ago and seeing how respectful the general public was to requests regarding, people giving others a little bit more distance, a little bit more courtesy. Mark, it reminds me of New York City after 9/11. everybody it was like a slap upside the head and a reminder that we're all kind of in this together and being more courteous. I was in New York for New Year's at a trade show right after 9/11. And it was a very different tone than the year before. And Florida was that way. So I'm not going to let the media worry us too much about that on either side. People are people, and generally people are good people.
By the way, Dave Sweet and his team have already started putting tickets on sale for Whiskey and Barrel Night in New York City, June 17th, along with events this fall near San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. The Whiskey Obsession Festival will be followed in April by the Nth Universal Whiskey Experience at the Wynn Resort in Las Vegas, April 23rd and 24th. Once again, Nth founder Mahesh Patel and his team have been working closely with the Wynn Resort and local health officials on a health protocol for the weekend, including mandatory masks, temperature checks, on-site medical personnel, and a no hugs or handshakes policy. On a personal note, I've been asked a number of times when I'll be ready to start going to whiskey events once again. The answer is I'm not quite sure. I know it will not be until after our family has been vaccinated. That could be in the next few weeks, but even then it's going to be a while before I'll feel comfortable in large crowds. I may be ready to start visiting some distilleries nearby soon, those that don't require airline flights. And as Dave Sweet suggested in our conversation, maybe by this fall we can be back to something approximating normal. I know we're all getting really tired of being patient, but hang in there just a little bit longer. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by the Distiller's Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts. Look for the new 2020 editions of Bourbon, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. Get all the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Cascade Hollow's Nicole Austin was named Distillery Manager of the Year in Whiskey Magazine's Global Icons of Whiskey Awards this week. Her latest project is the second edition of Cascade Moon Whiskey. This one includes the first barrel of George Dickel, filled after the distillery reopened in 2003, along with 19 other barrels in the blend. It's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of cherry pie, soft spices, and touches of oak, honey, caramel candy, and a hint of old leather. The taste starts off with a nice balance of cherries and oak tannins, followed by touches of molasses, clove, and black pepper, with vanilla, honey, and caramel in the background. The finish, long and subtle, with hints of cherry pie, spices, and oak. I'm scoring Cascade Moon Edition number 2 a 91. Paul John's PX Select Cask won the World Whiskies Award from Whiskey Magazine for the best Indian single malt whiskey. I've had a sample sitting on my tasting table for a while now. It's bottled at 48% ABV. The nose is full of toffee, figs, caramel candy, honey, brown sugar, and just a hint of oak. The taste has a spicy burst at the beginning that fades to reveal notes of black cherries, brown sugar, figs, and a touch of barley sugar. The finish, dry and dusty with lingering spices and a nice sweetness. I'm scoring the Paul John PX Select Cask Single Malt a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Want to find out just how Sagamore Spirit is reviving and evolving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey, including its new tequila cask-finished rye? In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore, But you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. Purchase bottles from your local retailer, and a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each product. Visit sagamorespirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access the tastings. Please drink responsibly. I spent some time in a Zoom tasting this week with Johnny Walker master blender Emma Walker. She's responsible for creating the Jane Walker blended malt. It's only the second blended malt release for Johnny Walker, along with Green Label. Jane Walker is a blend of malts from Cardew and Kleinleach distilleries, bottled at 41.9% ABV. Remember that. It'll be important later on. The nose has an orchard-like character with touches of green apples, peaches, and ripe cherries, along with a nice maltiness and hints of dark chocolate and honey. The taste has notes of toffee, apple cobbler, fresh berries, a hint of plums, dark chocolate, honey, and subtle spices. And adding a few drops of water amps up both the spices and the fruity notes on the palate. The finish is long with touches of baking spices, apple cobbler, and hints of toffee and plums. Overall, it's a very complex whiskey. I'm scoring the Jane Walker blended malt a 93. And by the way, we'll hear from Emma Walker in just a few minutes on Behind the Label. Had another Zoom tasting with the folks from Castle and Key Distillery to taste those 4 Slow Hands single-barrel ryes that I mentioned during the news. All 4 are between 3.5 and 4 years old. My personal favorite of the 4 was barrel number 396. It came in at 56% ABV and was from a batch distilled with a different yeast strain than the other 3. The nose is luscious and well-rounded, with touches of dark chocolate, toffee, dried flowers, and a hint of raisin bread. The taste is chewy and thick with cloves, cinnamon, and ginger, balanced by brown sugar, dark chocolate, candied orange slices, and fig cookies. The finish is long, thick, and just a bit spicy. I'm scoring Slow Hands Single Barrel Rye, barrel number 396, a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,100 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Dewar's guy. I've seen a lot in my years as a brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got to host a Dewar's tasting for some members of a major European royal family. Now, I'm not going to say which one, but they did invite me to come stay at their castle. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie McLeod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It's a great introduction to scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Dewar's 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Last time around, I shared my tasting notes for the Two Stacks Irish Whiskey Dram in a Can, 100 milliliter cans of 43% ABV blended Irish whiskey. We also discussed the Dram in a Can the other night on the Happy Hour webcast with Udo Sontag, Sam Simmons, Dave Worthington, and Lou Bryson. Debbie Serta posted this comment on Facebook from Austin, Texas. I'll take whiskey in a can over a seltzer any day. And Debbie, I have to admit that I agree with you on that one. Whoever's in charge of the Instagram account for the San Francisco Whiskey Club posted this comment. Doesn't matter how gimmicky it is. All that matters is the quality of the liquid, which I suspect isn't great. We'll have to listen. Actually, I thought it wasn't bad at all, but you will have to listen to the last episode to get my tasting notes for it. I'd like to thank everyone who sent along their congratulations after Whiskey Magazine's awards ceremony that was streamed on Thursday. I am humbled and proud, as I mentioned earlier, to have won the Communicator of the Year Worldwide Award, and I'd like to share a couple of the comments. Scott Harris of WhiskyCast sponsor Catoctin Creek tweeted this: "Well-deserved, buddy. The finest journalism in whiskey matters." Thank you, Scott. Since I mentioned that I might be ready to start visiting nearby distilleries once I'm vaccinated, this one also seems appropriate. The folks at Dad's Hat Rye, just north of Philadelphia, and just across the river from us, tweeted this: "Once COVID-19 is clear, we would love to have you over for a toast to your award." I'll keep you posted, guys. Looking forward to that. And from our good friend Lawrence Graham, one of the masterminds behind the Victoria Whiskey Festival and Whiskey Intel on Twitter, "Well-deserved, Mark. You'll have to bring your award-winning ways to hashtag VWF 2022. Count on that, Lawrence. I missed being able to see you guys this year. I really appreciate all of the kind comments that have come in over the last few days, and none of this would be possible without all of you. Thank you. If there's something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. While one or two people may get the public credit for creating a specific whiskey, there's almost always a much larger team that plays a role in the process over the years that whiskeys are maturing in the warehouse. During the Jane Walker Zoom tasting with whiskey writers the other day that I referred to a few minutes ago, Johnny Walker master blender Emma Walker was asked to describe how the blending team works with the folks at Diageo's distilleries.
If you think about it, we've got 29, 30 distilleries, and we need to make sure that what's being produced now is exactly what we need for blending in 5 years' time, 8 years' time, 12 years' time, 50 years' time. We've got an amazing inventory manager, Ewan Lomax, who can see in the matrix. He just has a grasp of figures that none of the rest of us can match. So we work together, but we're in weekly conversations with our colleagues in distillation and maturation. So we're very much involved in the quality conversations. So we've got a very talented group of people up in Elgin that are the nosing panel. So they know all of the new make malt comes off, but we then talk with them a lot and we agree on what the targets, what are we looking for from each distillery. Same at Cameron Bridge Distillery as well. So we've got a very talented panel there that look after the quality of all of our grain whiskies. We work very closely with our colleagues in maturation, so we know exactly what's happening with the casks, and we also work with them in terms of innovation. So we'll talk about rejuvenated casks in a minute with the Gold Reserve, but that was something that came out of the technical centre that I work at, where it was like, how can we look to use our casks in a very sustainable way, sort of be able to reuse them? So once we've extracted the activity, how do we then sort of refire them? How do we get flavour from them and make sure we get good maturation? So that came from research work in the part that I work in, but then became a sort of a business standard and shared out. So most of what we do is very much a sort of symbiotic relationship. It's all done in partnership with the other parts of the business.
One other part of the story behind Jane Walker sparked my interest. I mentioned in my tasting notes that this blended malt was bottled at 41.9% ABV. That is an unusual bottling strength for a blend. Usually you'd see those at 40%, maybe 43%, while cask strength bottlings are almost always likely to come in at a fractional strength. So I asked Emma to explain how she and her colleagues settled on 41.9% for Jane Walker.
We actually tried quite a few different strengths, and we took it down to 40 because that's the strength that we normally produce Black Label at. And it was a little bit subdued. It was still lovely, but it was just a little bit closed. We went up to about 45, and it was a little bit too much alcohol. That became overpowering. You lost some of the sort of fruitiness. So we just started taking iterations. It was literally just an afternoon playing with a pipette in the lab, and I found that actually 42 was pretty good. Took it down to 41.5 was pretty good, and was literally just balancing two glasses together and seeing what we came up with. And for me, 41.9 seemed to be the sweet spot. So then went back to another set and did it a lot more precise, and got agreement from other people in the lab that seemed to be just where you got that lovely balance. So you were getting the sort of sweetness, you're getting the chocolate notes, but you're also getting the different types of fruit coming through. So like you say, you're still getting those appley notes, but then you're getting where you get plums, I'm getting a wee bit more white peaches. But that was really interesting because you get that mix of these different fruit flavours. But that seemed to be the sweet spot for getting that ripe fruit coming through on the nose and on the palate. Because it was like at the different dilutions, you'd maybe get a little bit more on the nose, but it seemed to sort of almost blank it out a little bit more on the palate. So it was just a lot of coming and going with that.
This is an experiment you can replicate at home with samples of a cask-strength whiskey, and there are online calculators available to help you determine how much water to add to each sample to reach different proof strengths. Since websites can come and go over time, but podcasts live forever, just Google something along the lines of distilling calculators or alcohol dilution calculator to find one that works for you. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. Of course, you'll also find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. I love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
At Dewar's, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Caribbean Smooth whiskey finished in rum casks, or Illegal Smooth finished in mezcal casks. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing. Because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.